The Hells Angels biker found the little girl crushed under a falling beam in a stormed barn, and his raw force defied disaster. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It was the middle of a violent storm, with wind howling and rain slashing down from the sky. A Hells Angels biker, known for his towering presence and rough exterior, was riding through the countryside on his Harley-Davidson, trying to escape the rage of nature as much as his own thoughts. His name was Jake Reaper Morrison, a man whose past was as rugged as the roads he had ridden. The storm made visibility nearly impossible, but Jake had faced worse. As the rain pounded against his leather jacket, he noticed something unusual through the sheets of rain. A flash of light from a barn up ahead caught his eye, and he instinctively swerved his bike toward it. When he approached, he saw the barn doors partially open, creaking in the wind, revealing a faint silhouette inside. Without thinking, Jake pulled his bike to a halt and dismounted, the cold air biting at his skin as he rushed toward the barn. Inside, the scene was one of chaos. The storm had caused part of the barn's roof to collapse, and beneath the heavy wooden beams lay a small figure, barely moving. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, was trapped under a fallen beam. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with terror. She was gasping for breath, the weight of the beam pressing down on her chest. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had seen plenty of danger in his years, but this was different. Without a second thought, he dropped to his knees beside the little girl, trying to assess the situation. The rain was pouring through the broken roof, making the wooden beams slick with water, but Jake's mind was focused solely on her. He could see she was struggling, barely able to breathe, and the weight of the beam was crushing her body. Her legs were pinned, and her arms were trembling from the effort of trying to push the beam off. The biker's rough exterior softened for a moment as he looked into her frightened eyes. "Hey, it's okay. I've got you," he said in a deep, soothing voice. She didn't respond, but he could see a glimmer of hope in her eyes. He knew he didn't have much time. The storm was getting worse, and he couldn't let the roof collapse further. With a forceful grunt, Jake used all his strength to push the beam off her, his muscles straining under the weight. The moment the beam was lifted, the girl let out a small, relieved gasp, but she was still too weak to move. He scooped her up gently, cradling her in his arms like she was a fragile doll. "Don't worry. I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he muttered as he carefully made his way out of the barn. Every step was a battle against the storm, but Jake's determination was stronger than the wind and rain. As he reached his bike, the girl's body went limp in his arms. She was unconscious, but alive. Jake knew he had to get her to safety, fast. He placed her carefully on his bike, securing her with his jacket to keep her warm. The storm made riding treacherous, but Jake wasn't about to leave her behind. He revved the engine and sped off, praying the roads would hold as he made his way to the nearest town. The wind screamed in his ears, and the rain lashed against him. But he kept his focus on the girl, his only thought to get her the help she needed. As he rode, Jake's mind raced. He was a Hells Angels biker, tough, feared, and respected by many. But as he held this little girl in his arms, he felt something he hadn't in years. Something soft. Something real. This wasn't just another night of reckless riding. This was a moment that could change everything. And he wasn't going to let her down. As Jake continued his ride through the storm, the rain poured harder, and the wind whipped against his face. The girl, still unconscious, was cradled gently against his chest, wrapped in his jacket for warmth. The night had grown darker, and the roads were slick with the relentless downpour. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars, but his mind was elsewhere. Every mile felt like an eternity. He knew he had to get her to safety, fast. His bike roared through the storm, the sound echoing in the vast, empty landscape, but his focus was entirely on the girl. He had seen plenty of dangerous situations in his life, but this was different. He wasn't just a biker trying to survive a rough night. He was a protector now, and that was a feeling he hadn't had in years. He thought about his past, the years spent riding with the Hells Angels, living by a code of violence and power. His reputation was built on fear, on strength, on being the one others couldn't challenge. But as he looked down at the little girl, his heart softened in a way he couldn't explain. She had no one, and he couldn't help but think about how he might have turned out differently if someone had cared for him when he was her age. The ride was a struggle, the weather only growing worse as he made his way down the winding, narrow road. The headlights of his bike barely pierced the thick veil of rain, and the road beneath him was slippery with mud and water. Every turn was a challenge, every bump in the road a risk that could send him flying. But he wasn't going to stop. He couldn't. He glanced down at her, her small body limp against him, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She was still alive, but the weight of the beam had taken its toll. Jake's thoughts shifted to the crash, the barn, the way she had looked at him with such fear when he first approached her. He could still see her eyes, wide with terror, wondering if he would hurt her. A part of him understood that fear. He had been raised in a world where trust was rare, where people were out to take advantage of you at every turn. He had learned to guard his emotions, to keep his distance. But looking at this little girl, stranded and alone in the middle of a storm, made him feel something else, a sense of duty, of responsibility. And it was a feeling he wasn't used to. As he rode on, he noticed the road ahead was getting even more dangerous. The wind howled louder, and the rain turned into a relentless downpour, almost blinding him. The bike was starting to lose traction on the slick asphalt, and he could feel his tires struggling to maintain grip. He pushed forward, determined to get her to safety, but deep down, he knew that the storm was not going to make this easy. Just as the storm seemed to reach its peak, Jake spotted a small farmhouse in the distance. The lights inside flickered like a beacon in the dark, offering a glimmer of hope. He pushed the bike harder, leaning into the wind as he approached the driveway. The farmhouse was old, with a weathered porch and a small barn in the back. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. He pulled the bike up to the porch, dismounted, and carefully lifted the girl off the bike. She stirred slightly in his arms, her eyelids fluttering, but she was still unconscious. Jake carried her up the steps and knocked firmly on the door. A few moments passed before the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, her gray hair tied back in a bun. Her eyes widened when she saw Jake carrying the little girl. "What happened to her?" the woman asked, concern evident in her voice. Jake's jaw tightened. "She was trapped in a barn, under a falling beam. She's been through hell. I need to get her inside, and I need to keep her warm." The woman stepped aside, letting him in. "Come on in. I've got blankets and a fire going. She'll be safe here." Jake nodded, grateful for the woman's hospitality, though he didn't know what he had expected. He laid the girl down on the couch by the fire, and the elderly woman immediately started making her comfortable, covering her with a thick quilt and offering her a warm cup of tea. Jake stood by, watching. His mind was racing. There was no time to relax. He had to stay vigilant. The storm wasn't done yet, and he knew there would be more challenges ahead. As the girl's breathing grew steadier, Jake took a step back, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He had always been a man of action, never one to sit idly by. But for the first time in a long while, he found himself feeling something deeper, something more than just survival. Something that made him want to protect this little girl, to make sure she was safe from whatever dangers might still be lurking out there in the storm. He looked out the window, the wind still howling, the rain still pouring, and he made a decision in that moment. He wasn't going anywhere. Not until she was safe. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was her protector. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling through the small farmhouse and making the old windows rattle in their frames. Jake stood near the window, watching the downpour, his mind unable to rest. He had brought the girl inside, had gotten her warm and comfortable, but something inside him refused to let him relax. He had been through countless storms in his life, both literal and figurative, but this one felt different. The little girl, still unconscious on the couch, had stirred a part of him that he thought had long been buried. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he felt a deep sense of responsibility for her, something he hadn't felt in years. As he turned back to the room, he noticed the elderly woman tending to the girl. She had a quiet, gentle nature about her, moving around the room with ease as she checked the blankets and ensured the fire kept burning. Jake wasn't used to being around such warmth, especially from someone who didn't know him. He had been a Hells Angels biker for most of his life, feared and respected by many, but in this moment, he felt like an outsider in his own skin. The old woman glanced over at him, noticing the way he was watching the girl. "She'll be all right," she said softly, her voice soothing. "The storm's bad, but we've got enough firewood and food to last. She just needs rest and a bit of care. She'll pull through." Jake nodded, though his thoughts were still racing. He had done what he needed to do. He had saved her from the wreckage of the barn, gotten her to safety, but now what? He couldn't just leave her here. He knew he couldn't. His life, the life of a biker, had been about taking care of himself, surviving by his own code. But this was different. This little girl needed more than just survival. She needed protection, and that was something he could give her. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. The old woman set a cup of tea on the table beside Jake, as if sensing his unease. "You've done a good thing," she said. "Don't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You're here now. That's all that matters." Jake didn't respond, his gaze drifting back to the girl. He had been through hell in his own life, his own personal battles that no one else had ever seen. He had lost family, friends, and his own peace of mind to a life of violence and rebellion. But standing here, watching over this innocent child, made him wonder if there was a way out. A way to find redemption. A way to protect someone who needed him, just like he had needed someone to protect him when he was young. The girl stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around the room, confused and disoriented, before her eyes settled on Jake. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the crackling of the fire. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice softer than he had intended. She nodded, her small voice barely a whisper. "I think so." Jake crouched down beside her, careful not to startle her. "You're safe now. The storm is outside. You're in a safe place." The girl looked at him, her eyes wide, still filled with fear. But there was something else in them, something that made Jake's chest tighten. She wasn't just afraid of the storm. She was afraid of something else. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't used to answering questions like that. In his world, the only questions were about survival, about strength. But this little girl was asking him about himself, and he didn't know how to answer. He paused for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and steady. "I'm just a guy who's here to help," he said, though the words felt hollow. The girl looked at him for a long moment, then nodded as if she understood. Jake stood up, giving her some space, not wanting to overwhelm her. The storm continued to rage outside, but the warmth inside the house felt like a small oasis in the middle of the chaos. "What's your name?" Jake asked gently. The girl hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Lily," she said. "Lily, what happened?" Jake asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. She paused, her eyes filling with tears. I was with my parents. But then the storm, it came. And the barn, it collapsed." Her voice trailed off, and she looked down, tears streaming down her face. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen people suffer in many ways, but this was different. This was the kind of pain that no one should have to endure, the kind that no child should ever have to experience. "You're safe now," Jake said softly, reaching out to gently pat her hand. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, a recognition that he was her protector now. And in that moment, Jake made a decision. He wasn't just going to help her survive. He was going to make sure that she was safe, that she was protected. No one would hurt her again, not on his watch. But even as he made that vow, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. The storm might have passed, but the real storm was just beginning. There were dangers lurking in the shadows, and he would have to face them head on if he was going to keep his promise to Lily. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a misty, damp landscape. The air was still heavy with the remnants of rain, and the sky, though no longer filled with dark clouds, was still a shade of gray. The small farmhouse where Jake had taken Lily was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional crackling of the fire in the hearth and the soft rustling of the wind outside. Jake stood by the window, watching as the world slowly began to dry out, but his mind was far from at peace. Lily was still asleep on the couch, the blanket wrapped around her small frame, her breathing steady but soft. Jake had stayed up most of the night, sitting by the fire, his thoughts racing. He had promised to protect her, but what did that really mean? The life he had lived was one of violence, distrust, and isolation. He had been part of a brotherhood that valued strength above all else, where emotions were weakness and vulnerability was a liability. But now, standing in the quiet of this farmhouse, watching over a child who had lost everything, Jake realized that his definition of strength was starting to shift. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He wasn't just a man running from his past. He had a responsibility now, and that responsibility went beyond survival. Jake rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the realization. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew that Lily couldn't go back to the life she had known. She had already been through too much. As the morning dragged on, Jake prepared a pot of coffee, the smell filling the small kitchen. He knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't stay in this farmhouse forever. He had no ties to this place, no real future here. But he couldn't leave Lily either. She was vulnerable, and even though the storm had passed, there were still dangers out there. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, he heard a soft rustling from the living room. Lily was awake. She sat up slowly, her eyes still heavy with sleep, but wide with curiosity as she looked around the room. She seemed disoriented at first, as if she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. But then her eyes found Jake, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice gentle, though he was still unsure of how to approach her. Lily nodded, but her expression was pained, as though the memories of the previous day were still too fresh. "My parents," she whispered, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. Jake felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He knew how much it hurt to lose family, to lose everything. He had been through it himself. He didn't know how to respond, so he just sat down next to her, offering her the warmth of his presence. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said softly, his voice full of empathy. She wiped her eyes, nodding silently. "I don't know what happened. Everything was fine." And then, her voice trailed off, and she seemed to withdraw into herself, the weight of her loss too much to bear. Jake didn't have the answers. He wasn't a counselor, and he certainly wasn't prepared for this. But what he did know was that he couldn't leave her alone. She needed protection, and he would give it to her, no matter the cost. The next few hours passed in a quiet haze, both of them unsure of what the future held. Jake made breakfast for them both, and they ate in silence, the unease hanging in the air. Jake knew they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to leave, to find somewhere safe for Lily, somewhere she could start over. But he also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still people out there who might be looking for her, who might want to take advantage of her vulnerability. And he would be damned if he let that happen. As the morning faded into the afternoon, Jake stood up, his resolve hardening. He turned to Lily, who was sitting quietly on the couch, staring into the fire. "We can't stay here forever," he said gently. "I know it's hard, but we need to get moving. I'll keep you safe, I promise." Lily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a glimmer of trust. She nodded slowly, as if she understood what had to be done. Jake gathered their things and prepared to leave. It wasn't the plan he had imagined when he woke up this morning, but it was a start. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was someone's protector. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like the right thing to be. The drive was long, the road stretching out endlessly ahead, but Jake wasn't paying much attention to the miles passing beneath him. His mind was focused on Lily, sitting quietly behind him on the motorcycle, her small hands gripping his waist for support. She had said little since they left the farmhouse, but he could feel the weight of her sadness and uncertainty. She hadn't spoken much about her parents, and Jake knew it was too soon to push her for more information. The storm had passed, but the emotional storm inside her was far from over. As they neared the outskirts of the nearest town, Jake began to slow down. He had a plan, sort of. He wasn't sure where they were headed exactly, but he had a few places in mind that could offer shelter, at least temporarily. It wasn't much, but it was all he had to work with. He couldn't keep her in hiding forever, but for now, he needed to keep her safe. "Are you okay back there?" Jake asked, his voice quiet but steady, trying to break the silence between them. Lily didn't answer at first, but after a few moments, she spoke. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the bike. I don't know what's going to happen." Jake's grip on the handlebars tightened. He understood. The uncertainty, the fear, it was all too familiar to him. But he couldn't afford to let those emotions control him. He had to be strong, for her. They reached a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered in the dim light of the evening, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Jake pulled the bike into a spot, the engine rumbling as he killed it. He turned to Lily. "Stay close to me," he said. "We'll get a room, and we'll figure things out from there." Lily nodded, though her expression remained distant. She hadn't said much since the night in the farmhouse, and Jake didn't expect her to open up now. He wasn't sure what kind of help she needed, but he knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. They walked into the motel's small office, and Jake approached the counter. The woman behind the desk looked up at him, her expression neutral but wary. Jake's leather jacket and the Hell's Angels patches were a dead giveaway, and he could see the hesitation in her eyes. He didn't blame her. He didn't look like someone you'd want to get too close to. "Room for two?" he asked, his voice low and casual. The woman hesitated, then nodded. "We have a vacancy," she said, her eyes darting to Lily for a moment before quickly looking away. Jake paid for the room, and they made their way to the second-floor unit. The door creaked as he opened it, revealing a small, basic room with 2 beds, a worn-out carpet, and peeling wallpaper. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Jake set their bags down by the door, and Lily stood silently in the middle of the room. She didn't seem to know what to do with herself, and for a moment, neither did Jake. He knew she needed something, but he didn't know what. He wasn't good at this, at being the person someone else depended on. He had spent his entire life relying only on himself. But now, there was this little girl, looking to him for something he wasn't sure he could provide. "You can rest," Jake said, breaking the silence. "I'll get you something to eat later. You need to get your strength back." Lily nodded, but she still didn't say anything. Jake watched her for a moment, then stepped out of the room, giving her space. As he stood in the hallway, his mind began to race again. He couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, someone would come looking for Lily, and when that happened, Jake would have to be ready. But for now, the most important thing was keeping her safe, keeping her from becoming just another victim of the world they both lived in. When Jake returned with some food, Lily was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. She didn't acknowledge him as he set the bag down on the small table by the door. He didn't expect her to. She had been through a lot more than he could understand, and he didn't have the right to force her to talk. He placed a tray of food in front of her, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she sat there, lost in thought. Jake's gaze softened as he watched her. He had seen countless people in his life, people who were hardened by their circumstances, people who had learned to survive. But this was different. This was a child who had lost everything in an instant. He didn't know how to fix it, didn't know if he could. But he would try. "You're not alone," Jake said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Lily finally turned her head, meeting his gaze. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe hope, maybe fear, maybe both. Jake felt the weight of his words, the promise that hung in the air between them. He wasn't just promising to protect her from physical harm. He was promising to help her find some kind of peace, some kind of stability. It was a promise that carried more weight than he had ever expected. Lily finally picked up the food, her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't say anything. Jake took a step back, giving her space to eat. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. And in that moment, Jake realized that, for better or worse, his life had changed. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was her protector, and he would fight for her, no matter what. The days seemed to blur together, each one passing in the quiet tension of the motel room. Jake kept to a strict routine, his mind always on alert, his thoughts constantly drifting between the past and the present. The only constant now was Lily. She had begun to open up, albeit in small, hesitant ways. She no longer stared blankly out the window all day, though her silence remained. Jake had learned to accept that. It was clear that Lily was still carrying the weight of everything she had lost. The mornings were the hardest. He would wake up early, before the sun had fully risen, and the first thing he did was check on her. She would still be asleep, curled up under the blanket, her body small and fragile in the bed. He had grown protective of her, watching her every move as if she were something precious he had to guard. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world outside was closing in on them. They couldn't stay at the motel forever. It wasn't safe. But the thought of moving again, of leaving the little bit of comfort they had found, made him uneasy. His thoughts kept drifting back to the people he had once ridden with. The Hell's Angels. He had been a part of that brotherhood for years, known for his brutal enforcer role. It was a life he had chosen, or perhaps a life that had chosen him. But now, as he stood at the edge of a new life with Lily, he was questioning everything. He had always relied on his strength to survive, but now, he found himself questioning what true strength meant. Was it physical power, the ability to survive? Or was it something more? Lily was learning to trust him, but how long could he keep her safe without drawing attention to himself? His life as a biker had never been one of discretion. People knew him, feared him, and that fear had always worked in his favor. But now, he was no longer just a lone rider. He was her protector, and that meant he had to keep her hidden, keep her safe from the dangers that lingered outside. He couldn't let anyone find her. He couldn't let anyone hurt her. One afternoon, as they were sitting together in the motel room, Lily spoke for the first time in days. "Jake, do you think we'll ever be okay again?" Her voice was small, barely above a whisper, but it hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He looked at her, his heart aching. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll make sure you're safe. I promise you that." He reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder, the weight of his words settling between them. Lily didn't say anything in response, but Jake could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes, a small spark of hope. That was all he needed. As the days passed, Jake kept his promise to her. He spent his time finding new places they could stay, moving them every few days to avoid suspicion. He had become a ghost in his own life, hiding in plain sight, always looking over his shoulder. It wasn't easy. The fear of being found, of being hunted, was always there, lurking in the background. But it was the price he was willing to pay to keep Lily safe. They couldn't stay on the run forever. Jake knew that. He knew that one day, someone would catch up to them. The thought gnawed at him. The storm had passed, but the real storm was just beginning. One evening, as Jake sat outside their latest hideout, a small cabin on the edge of a quiet town, he heard the unmistakable sound of motorcycles approaching. His heart skipped a beat, and instinctively, he stood up, his eyes scanning the horizon. He saw the headlights cutting through the darkness. It was them, the Hells Angels, his brothers. Or at least, they used to be. The motorcycles roared to a stop in front of the cabin, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had never imagined this would happen. The last time he had seen his brothers, they had cast him out. He had chosen to leave the life of the club behind, but he had never thought they would come after him. Not like this. A man stepped off one of the bikes, tall and imposing, his face hidden behind a dark visor. He pulled it off, revealing the familiar face of Steele, the president of the Michigan chapter. Jake's heart sank. Steele had always been a no-nonsense kind of guy, and he wasn't here for a friendly visit. "Jake," Steele said, his voice low and gravelly. "We need to talk." Jake took a step back, his body tense, his mind racing. This was the moment he had feared. This was the moment everything he had worked for, everything he had built with Lily, could come crashing down. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice cold, his stance defensive. Steele didn't answer right away. He simply stared at Jake, his expression unreadable. "You've made a mess of things, Jake," Steele said finally. "You left the club, but you didn't leave it behind. You brought trouble with you." Jake's heart raced. He knew what this was about. The Hells Angels never let anyone leave without consequences. And now, the price for his escape was coming due. "I'm not the one causing trouble," Jake said, his voice sharp. "I'm trying to protect someone." Steele raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering over to the cabin, where Lily was inside, unaware of the danger approaching. "Is that so?" Steele's tone was skeptical. "Because it sure looks like you're running from something. And you're not alone." Jake's heart skipped. Steele had seen something. He knew there was more to the story. And Jake wasn't sure how much longer he could keep running from the past. He knew one thing for sure. His promise to Lily was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The tension in the air was palpable as Steele stood there, his eyes scanning Jake with a look of disbelief. The distant rumble of motorcycles still lingered in the background, but everything seemed to go quiet as Jake processed the words. He had expected something like this, but now that it was here, the reality felt far more dangerous than he had imagined. Steele had always been a man of few words, and when he spoke, it was never good news. "You've made a mistake, Jake," Steele said, his voice carrying a quiet threat. "You don't walk away from the club, not without consequences. And you, damn sure don't drag trouble with you." Jake's heart pounded, but his expression remained calm. He had lived through worse, faced down bigger threats than this. But this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about Lily. He wasn't going to let her be dragged into his past. Not now. Not ever. I didn't drag anyone into anything. Jake responded, his voice steady but firm. I left the club. And that's that. I'm not going back, and I'm not causing trouble for anyone. I'm protecting someone now. Someone who doesn't deserve any of this. Steele's gaze flickered over to the cabin. Jake could see the slight shift in his posture as he realized what Jake was talking about. The old biker's expression softened for just a fraction of a second, but the hardness quickly returned. You're serious about this, aren't you? Steele asked, his tone still skeptical. Jake didn't flinch. He knew this was going to be a fight, but he was ready. I'm serious. And I'm not backing down. There was a long silence between them, the air thick with tension. Steele shifted his weight, as if weighing his options. He had always been a calculating man, never one to make a decision in haste. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, Steele spoke again. Fine. You can walk away, Jake. But there's a price. You know that. Jake nodded. He had known it was coming. The club didn't just let people go, especially not someone with his history. What's the price? Jake asked, his voice low. Steele looked him dead in the eye, his gaze intense. You'll have to answer to the consequences. We'll keep an eye on you, and if you ever step out of line again, if you ever come back, we'll handle it. Don't think for a second that this is over. Jake's jaw clenched. He understood the warning. The Hells Angels weren't a group you could walk away from easily. They didn't forgive. They didn't forget. But for Lily, Jake was willing to take the risk. He would fight anyone who came for them. I'm not going back, Jake said, his voice resolute. And if you try to come for me or her, you'll regret it. Steele regarded him for a moment, his face unreadable. The air between them was thick with unspoken threats, but Steele didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded. Slowly, almost as if to say that he understood. Then, he turned to walk back to his bike, signaling the others to follow. This isn't over, Jake, Steele called over his shoulder. We'll be watching. Jake watched them ride off, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. The weight of the situation settled over him like a heavy cloak, but he didn't let it show. He had done what he needed to do to protect Lily. Now, he had to focus on keeping her safe. As the dust settled and the sound of the motorcycles disappeared, Jake turned back to the cabin. He knew there was no going back to his old life. The Hells Angels were done with him, and he was done with them. But that didn't mean the danger was gone. He needed to keep moving. They needed to stay hidden. Jake walked back into the cabin, where Lily was still sitting by the window, her small form silhouetted against the pale light. She didn't turn around when he entered, but Jake could tell that she had been listening. She had heard everything. Are we safe? Lily asked, her voice small but filled with a quiet hope. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running, but he knew one thing for certain. We're safe for now, he said, though the words didn't feel as convincing as he wanted them to. He had made a promise to her. A promise to protect her no matter what. And he would keep that promise. But the world they were living in was full of dangers, and Jake knew that nothing in life was ever truly safe. Not anymore. Let's get some rest, Jake said, his voice softer now. We'll figure things out tomorrow. Lily didn't say anything, but she nodded and climbed into the bed. Jake watched her for a moment before sitting down by the door, his back against the frame. He wasn't going to sleep, not with everything that had happened. But at least Lily could. She deserved that much. And for now, that was enough. The morning was cold and still, the remnants of the storm hanging in the air like a heavy blanket. Jake sat by the window, staring out at the empty, mist-covered road that stretched far beyond the cabin. The world outside felt distant, unreachable, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to wonder if he could just walk away from it all. He shook his head, forcing the thought out of his mind. He couldn't walk away. Not now, not when Lily was depending on him. She had already been through so much. She needed him to stay strong. Inside, the cabin was quiet, save for the faint sound of the fire crackling in the hearth. The room felt smaller now, more intimate. It wasn't the same as the noisy chaos of his old life, but it was peaceful. And that peace was something Jake wasn't sure he deserved, but he would fight for it anyway. He had made a promise to keep Lily safe, and he was determined to honor that promise. Lily stirred on the couch, her small body shifting under the blankets. She had been sleeping better the past few nights, but Jake knew it was still hard for her. The loss of her parents was something she hadn't fully processed, and Jake understood that. He had lost everything once too. He knew what it was like to feel empty, to feel like you were adrift in a world that didn't care about you. But now, he wasn't just adrift anymore. He had a purpose, and that purpose was to protect Lily. As she slowly woke, her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she just stared at the ceiling, her expression blank. Then, her gaze shifted to Jake, and he saw that small spark of recognition in her eyes. "Good morning," Jake said softly, trying to sound casual, though he was still unsure of how to talk to her. She had been so quiet, so distant, but he knew that she was still processing everything. Lily blinked, then sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. "Morning," she mumbled, her voice still a little groggy. "How did you sleep?" Jake asked. She shrugged, her eyes flickering to the window. "Okay, I guess," she said. Jake could tell that there was still a lot on her mind, but he didn't press her. She needed time, and he would give it to her. He stood up and stretched, his muscles aching from the tension of the past few days. "I'm going to make some breakfast," he said, trying to keep things normal, trying to offer her a sense of routine, something she could rely on. As he cooked, he thought about their situation. He had no real plan beyond keeping them hidden, keeping them safe. Every decision felt like a step into the unknown, and Jake wasn't used to that. He was used to having control, having a plan. But with Lily, it felt different. He was no longer in charge of just his own fate. He had to think about hers too. He set a plate in front of her, and for the first time in days, she looked up at him with something resembling gratitude in her eyes. She took the plate, but she didn't say anything at first. They ate in silence, and Jake let her be. He could tell that she wasn't ready to talk, and that was fine. He had learned long ago that silence was often more meaningful than words. After breakfast, Jake cleaned up and then turned to Lily, who was still sitting on the couch, lost in her thoughts. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice serious. Lily didn't look up at him. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But where will we go?" Jake hesitated for a moment. He didn't have an answer. He didn't know where they could go that would be safe. The world was too big, too dangerous, and every place they moved seemed to come with its own set of problems. But he knew that he couldn't let her down. He had to keep moving. They had to keep running. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice more confident than he felt. "I'll make sure we're safe." He knew that wasn't enough to ease her fears, but it was the only promise he could make right now. After breakfast, they packed up quickly, the weight of the situation settling in again. Jake was already thinking about their next move, about where they would go next and how they would get there. But as he looked at Lily, standing in the doorway of the cabin, he realized that it wasn't the destination that mattered anymore. It was the journey. It was the fact that they were in this together. And as long as they had each other, they had a chance. They left the cabin and walked to the bike. Jake didn't look back. He couldn't. He knew that if he did, he would be tempted to stay, to give up the fight and settle for the safety they had found in that small cabin. But safety wasn't the answer. Not anymore. They had to keep moving, keep surviving. Jake revved the engine, and Lily climbed onto the back, clutching him for support as they drove off into the unknown. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just protecting Lily now. He was protecting their future. And that future, whatever it held, was something he was willing to fight for. The road stretched ahead, winding through the mountains as Jake and Lily rode in silence. The wind whipped past them, the chill of early morning creeping into their bones, but Jake hardly noticed. His thoughts were miles away, lost in the storm of everything that had happened. He had been a Hell's Angels enforcer, a man who had lived by his own rules, but now he was something else, a protector, a man trying to keep a promise to a young girl who had already lost so much. Lily clung to him from behind, her hands wrapped tightly around his waist, but she had become more than just a silent presence at his back. She had become the reason he got up every day. He had to keep her safe. That was all that mattered now. As they approached a small town, Jake's gaze flickered toward the buildings in the distance. He slowed the bike, keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble. It wasn't the first time they had passed through a town, but it was the first time Jake had felt a sense of urgency, a growing feeling that someone might be watching them. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt off. He pulled the bike into a small gas station, the sound of the engine stopping echoing in the quiet. Lily slid off the bike first, her small feet hitting the gravel as she glanced around. Jake got off slowly, his eyes scanning the area, taking in every detail. The station was deserted except for an old man sitting on a bench outside, his weathered face hiding behind a pair of dark sunglasses. He didn't seem to notice them, but Jake didn't trust anyone these days. He went inside, the bell above the door ringing softly as he entered. The cashier looked up from behind the counter, her expression neutral. She didn't recognize him, but that didn't matter. "Fuel?" she asked, her voice flat. Jake nodded, but before he could respond, he heard a faint sound coming from the doorway behind him. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the switchblade tucked into his jacket. A man had entered the gas station, his boots heavy against the tile as he walked in. His eyes locked onto Jake's instantly, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the man. It was one of his old brothers from the club, a man he had not seen in years. "Jake," the man said, his voice low but unmistakable. "I knew I'd find you here." Jake's body tensed. This was the last thing he needed. He didn't know what the man wanted, but he wasn't going to find out. Not with Lily standing outside. He couldn't afford to let his past catch up with him. Not now. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice cold. The man smirked, his posture relaxed as if he had all the time in the world. "I'm not here for trouble," he said, his eyes darting over to the door, where Lily was standing. "I just wanted to see how you're doing. You've been gone for a while, Jake, and we're wondering why." Jake's fingers tightened around the knife handle. "I'm not part of that life anymore," he said, his voice sharp. "Leave it be." The man's smile faded, but he didn't step forward. "It's not that easy, Jake. You don't just walk away from the brotherhood. You know that. And the fact that you're here with a kid, hiding out, well, that doesn't sit right with a lot of people." Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't let this man cause a scene. Not in front of Lily. Not when everything was at stake. "I'm not causing any trouble," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "And neither is she." The man studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he turned and walked back out of the store, leaving Jake standing in the middle of the room, heart pounding in his chest. Jake waited until he heard the sound of the man's footsteps fade before he made his way outside. Lily was still standing by the bike, looking around cautiously. When she saw Jake, she immediately looked at him, her face full of questions. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to keep his cool. "Just someone from my past," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's nothing." Lily didn't say anything else, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had been through so much, and now she was starting to realize that her past wasn't the only thing she had to be afraid of. They had to keep moving. The world was a dangerous place, and as much as Jake wished he could shield her from it all, he knew he couldn't. All he could do was keep her close and do everything in his power to protect her. As they got back on the bike, Jake revved the engine, his mind still whirling from the encounter. He didn't know how long they could keep running, but for now, he would focus on getting her to safety. The road ahead was uncertain, but with Lily by his side, Jake was determined to face whatever came their way. The past was never far behind, but it couldn't define them. Not anymore. The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of distant engines in the quiet town. It was the kind of day where the air hung heavy with uncertainty, and Jake knew they couldn't stay in one place too long. The encounter at the gas station had rattled him, and the reminder of his past, his former brothers from the Hells Angels, still echoed in his mind. Lily had been quiet since then, her eyes filled with unspoken questions that Jake wasn't sure how to answer. He had promised her safety, but with every passing day, the world around them felt smaller. He had no choice but to keep moving. He got up slowly, his body stiff from the tension of the past few days. He glanced over at Lily, who was still asleep on the couch, wrapped in the blankets, her small figure tucked up tight, as if trying to shield herself from the world. Jake let her sleep for a while longer. She needed rest, especially after everything she had been through. The weight of the promise he had made to her, the promise to protect her, was beginning to feel heavier every day. The Hells Angels weren't just a distant memory now. They were a looming presence that he couldn't escape, and it seemed like no matter how far he ran, they would always be just behind him, ready to pull him back in. He knew Steele hadn't been the only one looking for him. Jake's life in the club wasn't something you could walk away from. Once you were in for life. And leaving wasn't just about packing up and leaving town. It meant cutting ties, cutting off everything that had once defined you, and walking into the unknown. And now, with Lily in tow, that unknown had become all too real. Jake sighed, standing up and making his way to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to scan the street outside. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but Jake's instincts told him it wouldn't be long before they were found. He wasn't paranoid. He was just prepared. The life he had left behind didn't let you forget the lessons it taught you. As the sun rose higher, the first few cars began to roll down the street, a few locals heading to work or stopping for coffee. Jake quickly turned to the small table near the window where he had laid out their plans. There weren't many options left. Every place they had stayed so far had been temporary, a brief stop on the road to nowhere. He couldn't keep living like this, never knowing who might be watching, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. "We need to get moving," Jake muttered to himself. He looked back at Lily, still sleeping. The reality was, no matter how hard he tried to protect her, he couldn't keep running forever. He would need to face his past, face the people he had once called family. But not today, not while she was still asleep. For now, all he could do was keep her safe, keep her in the moment. As the clock ticked on, the moment arrived. Lily stirred awake, her eyes blinking slowly before focusing on Jake. "Morning," she mumbled softly, still half-dazed from sleep. Jake gave her a reassuring smile. "Morning. You sleep okay?" Lily nodded, but her eyes had the same weary look they had the day before. The weight of the world was pressing down on her, and Jake couldn't blame her. The road ahead was still uncertain, and he had no idea what it held for them. But he had promised her, and that was something Jake would never break. "You ready to go?" he asked. Lily looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Where to now?" she asked, her voice quiet, but filled with the faintest hint of curiosity. Jake didn't have a clear answer, but he was used to that by now. He had always lived on the edge, never knowing where the next day would take him. "We keep moving," he said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "That's the only plan we've got right now." Lily didn't question him, but she was silent as she stood up, gathering her things. Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She was starting to trust him, starting to understand that they were in this together. Jake couldn't protect her from the past, but he could protect her from the future, from whatever was out there waiting for them. As they stepped outside, the cool morning air hit them, a sharp reminder of the world they were living in. Jake scanned the street one more time, his instincts still on high alert. "Let's go," he said, leading Lily to the bike. She climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around him as they took off down the road. As they rode through the quiet town, Jake could feel the weight of their journey ahead. He wasn't sure where they would end up, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop. Not until Lily was safe. Not until he had done everything he could to give her a future that wasn't defined by the violence of his past. The road ahead was open, and Jake had no idea where it would lead, but as the miles rolled on beneath them, he knew he would face whatever came next. Together, they would keep moving, one step at a time. The road stretched before them like a never-ending ribbon of asphalt, winding through the dense woods and sprawling fields. The sun had begun to set, casting an orange glow across the horizon. Jake didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Lily was still behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, the same quiet fear that had lingered in her eyes ever since the night they left the farm. Still there. But there was something else, too. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was trust. But Jake could feel the difference. She wasn't as distant as before. She wasn't as guarded. They had spent the day on the road, making their way from one small town to another, always moving, always staying one step ahead of whatever might be waiting for them. And while the thought of the past, of Steel and the Hells Angels, weighed heavily on Jake's mind, he tried to push it aside. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Lily needed him. As the bike roared down the road, the landscape changing around them, Jake kept his eyes forward, but his thoughts kept drifting. He couldn't escape the fact that the Hells Angels were always going to be a part of his past. He had tried to leave it behind, to start over, but now it seemed like the club had a way of finding its own. He had no idea how much longer they could keep running, but he knew that sooner or later, someone would catch up. And that thought gnawed at him. For the first time in years, Jake felt like a man who was being hunted. He had always been the one doing the hunting. He had always been the one in control. But now, with Lily's safety in his hands, he felt vulnerable. They passed through a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else, and Jake's instincts kicked into high gear. His eyes scanned the streets, watching for anything that might seem out of place. The road was mostly empty, with a few people walking along the sidewalks, but Jake didn't let his guard down. He couldn't afford to. He had no idea what would happen if someone recognized him, but he wasn't ready to find out. "Jake, stop!" Lily's voice broke through his thoughts. He glanced over his shoulder, meeting her eyes for a moment. She had spoken quietly, but there was a sense of urgency in her tone. "What's wrong?" he asked, pulling over to the side of the road and bringing the bike to a slow stop. Lily didn't answer immediately. She was looking ahead, her gaze focused on something in the distance. Jake followed her line of sight, and his heart skipped a beat. At the end of the street, there was a group of men gathered in front of a bar. Their leather jackets and the unmistakable insignia they wore were a dead giveaway. It was the Hells Angels. Jake's heart raced. He didn't know how much time they had, but the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was it. They had found them. He had been trying to outrun his past, but it seemed like his past had finally caught up to him. "Get down," Jake ordered, his voice low and tense. He didn't want to panic her, but he needed to be ready. He pulled the bike into a small alleyway, out of sight, and killed the engine. He turned to Lily, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Listen to me. You need to stay quiet, stay low. We can't afford to get caught." Lily nodded, her face pale with fear, but there was no question in her eyes. She trusted him. Jake didn't waste any time. He quickly assessed their options. The alley they were in led to the back of a small convenience store, and he knew the layout of the town well enough to know there was a hidden exit through the side street that could get them out of there undetected. He glanced back toward the bar. The men were still talking, but Jake could see the telltale signs of familiarity in their movements. They weren't just passing through. They were looking for something. Or someone. He didn't need to wait around to figure out what it was. "We're going through the back," Jake said, his voice firm. He grabbed his jacket from the bike and pulled it on quickly. "Stay close to me." He led Lily through the alley, his footsteps quick and quiet as they moved toward the side street. Every instinct Jake had screamed at him to get out of there fast, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that was creeping up his spine. This was no coincidence. They had been found, and now they were being hunted. As they turned the corner, Jake's pulse quickened. They were almost there. The exit was just ahead, but before they could make it, a car pulled up beside them, blocking their path. Jake froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his waist. But the driver of the car wasn't a stranger. It was Steele. Jake's heart stopped. "We need to talk." "Jake," Steele said, his voice calm but laced with an unmistakable threat. Jake's muscles tensed, but he didn't move. "I told you before," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm done with the club." Steele stepped out of the car, his tall figure looming in front of them. He wasn't alone. Two other men stepped out from behind him, their eyes narrowing as they focused on Jake and Lily. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts darting from one possibility to the next. He had to protect her. He had to get her out of here. Steele seemed to notice the tension in Jake's posture. "I'm not here to fight you, Jake," Steele said. "I'm here to make sure you don't cause more trouble. But you've got to stop running." Jake knew there was no way out of this without facing the consequences. The Hells Angels weren't going to let him go without a price. But the question remained, would the price be worth it? The air between Jake and Steele thickened, the weight of the confrontation settling like a storm cloud over them. Steele stood there, his dark eyes locking onto Jake's with the kind of intensity that only years of shared history could cultivate. The two men had once been brothers, bound by a loyalty forged in the fires of their past. Now, that bond felt fragile, like a thread ready to snap. Jake's pulse hammered in his chest as he took a step forward, his body tense and ready for anything. But he couldn't let his emotions rule him. Not now. Not with Lily standing behind him, her small figure barely visible in the shadows of the alley. He had promised to protect her, and nothing, no one, was going to change that. "I told you," Jake said, his voice steady but with an edge that betrayed the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I'm done with the club. I'm done with everything." Steele's lips twitched in what might have been a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't get to walk away, Jake. Not just like that. You think you can leave without any consequences?" Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking for you to leave us alone." Steele's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "You think you're the only one who's been through hell? You think we don't care what happens to you? You're a part of us, Jake. And whether you like it or not, we're family. Jake's fists clenched, the anger bubbling up inside him. Family, he spat, his voice rising. That's what you call it? A bunch of men who use fear to control each other? Who ruin lives just to feel powerful? That's not family. That's a prison. Steele's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Jake could see the old man he had once known, the man who had fought beside him, bled with him, and called him a brother. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who was willing to do anything to hold on to the past. Steele stepped forward, closing the distance between them. You think you can leave all of this behind, Jake? You think you can just walk away from everything we built together? You're not as free as you think you are. The club doesn't let people like you go. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, but he didn't back down. I've already gone, Jake said, his voice low but unwavering. And I'm not looking back. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Steele studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide if Jake was bluffing. But Jake knew better. He wasn't bluffing. He was done. And the club wasn't going to make him go back. Not now. Not ever. Steele's gaze flickered to Lily, who was still standing quietly behind Jake. Her presence barely noticeable, but Jake could feel her eyes on them. This kid. She's the reason, isn't it? Steele asked, his voice softer now, but still laced with something Jake couldn't quite place. You think you can protect her by running? You think hiding from the past will make it go away? Jake's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he thought about the life they had left behind, the fear, the violence, the broken promises. And then he thought about Lily, about her wide eyes, her trust in him, her need for safety. I'm doing what I have to do, Jake said firmly. And I'm not running anymore. I'm staying here, with her. And if you're smart, you'll leave us alone. Steele's eyes narrowed, and the tension in the air grew thicker. For a moment, Jake thought he might have to fight his way out of this, that Steele wouldn't let him go without a fight. But then, to Jake's surprise, Steele stepped back. I'm not here to fight you, Jake, Steele said, his voice low. But you've got to understand something. You're not just running from the past. You're running from everything we built. And that's not something you can escape. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. Steele had made it clear that there were consequences, but Jake was willing to face them. For Lily. For the life he was trying to build. I've made my choice, Jake said quietly, turning his back on Steele. And you've made yours. Steele didn't move. I'll be back, he said, his voice cold. You're not done with us, Jake. You never will be. Jake didn't turn around. He couldn't. He didn't want to show Steele any weakness, any doubt. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. As Jake walked away, he heard the sound of Steele's footsteps retreating, the engines of the bikes firing up in the distance. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going back to the club. He wasn't going back to that life. And as long as Lily was with him, he would do whatever it took to protect her. He would face whatever challenges lay ahead. And he would never look back. The days that followed Steele's departure were tense, but Jake did his best to push the fear aside. He had made his decision, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't going back to the club, and he wasn't going to let them pull him back into that life. His only priority now was Lily. The road ahead was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, that was all that mattered. They continued to move from town to town, staying low, always looking over their shoulders. It wasn't a life Jake was used to. He had spent years fighting and surviving, never having to worry about anything but himself. But now, every decision he made felt like it had a consequence, not just for him, but for her. The bond they shared had grown deeper over the weeks. Lily was no longer just a scared child. She had become a symbol of hope for him, the only thing that kept him grounded in this unpredictable world. Jake found himself thinking more about the future, not just his, but hers. He couldn't let her grow up in the shadow of their past. She deserved more than that. One evening, as they sat in a small diner in another town, Jake looked at Lily, who was quietly eating her meal. She had started to smile more, laugh occasionally, and for the first time in a while, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to build a future together. Jake, do you think we'll ever find a place to stay for good? Lily asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that Jake had come to recognize. She wasn't just asking about the physical place. She was asking about a home. I don't know, Jake said honestly, the uncertainty of their situation clear in his eyes. "But I'll keep us safe. I promise you that." Lily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "I trust you," she said quietly, the words hitting him harder than he expected. It was more than just a child's trust. It was a bond that had been forged through shared hardship, through the struggles they had faced together. And it meant everything to Jake. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice steady, despite the storm of doubt swirling inside him. "We'll make it work. I'll make sure you're safe, no matter what." They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the diner around them providing a sense of normalcy they hadn't felt in months. But Jake knew that normalcy was a fragile thing. It was a luxury they couldn't afford. The world was still a dangerous place, and they would have to keep moving. They couldn't afford to settle down, not yet. The Hells Angels hadn't forgotten about him, and as long as he was alive, they would always be a shadow looming over their lives. But Jake was ready. He had faced worse things in his life than the threat of an outlaw gang. He wasn't afraid anymore. For Lily, he would fight to the end. After they finished their meal, they left the diner and climbed back onto the motorcycle. The cool evening air brushed past them as Jake revved the engine and set off down the road. He didn't know where they were going next, but it didn't matter. They would keep moving, keep surviving. And one day, when the world finally stopped chasing them, maybe they would find a place to call home. But for now, they were free. And that was enough. As they rode into the night, Jake glanced over his shoulder at Lily, who was once again holding on to him, her face hidden behind his back. He knew that she was still scared, still haunted by everything that had happened, but he also knew that she was stronger now. She had come a long way from the frightened girl trapped in the barn. She had become someone capable of hope, someone who could look at the future without seeing just the darkness. For the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to believe in that future, too. He wasn't just running anymore. He was moving forward. And with Lily by his side, he would face whatever came next, no matter how dangerous or uncertain the road ahead might be.